Hey guys, tonight we sneak into the cold chamber, where they uncovered 5 horrifying secrets inside Charles II's body that no one has dared to reveal. The first revelations stunned the medical world, but the 4th secret will shock you so deeply you won't think you can survive. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Comment below where you're watching from and what time it is locally. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the autumn of 1700, Charles II, the last king of the Habsburg line, exhaled his final breath in the icy chamber of the royal palace in Madrid, leaving behind a story both tragic and chilling. He ascended the throne in 1665, at the tender age of 4, immediately following the death of his father, King Philip IV. In the annals of history, the image of a child king, his head wrapped in a regal kerchief, yet eyes not yet bright with majesty, already burdened with the weight of keeping Spain's throne secure, strikes anyone who hears it with a pang of sorrow. Charles II, born in 1661, was the only surviving son of Philip IV and Empress Mariana of Austria. His father had been one of Europe's most formidable monarchs, extending Spain's influence through a series of brutal wars beyond its borders. His mother, Queen Mariana, of Habsburg Austrian blood, served as regent. When the young boy took the throne, she both sheltered him and bore the burden of governance, striving to maintain the illusion that the juvenile king possessed the ability to rule. Despite Charles's body having long borne a host of congenital deformities, a cleft lip, a receding jaw that twisted his mouth, an overly large tongue that rendered his speech slurred, and numerous other malformations. Within the palace, the fear of inbreeding hung over the court like a dark mist. Before Charles, other princes, including his elder brother Philip Prospero, had each died at the age of only 4 or 5. Every death brought fresh anguish, each funeral fanfare marking a new succession crisis. The Habsburgs, with a centuries-old tradition of marrying cousins and close kin to preserve pure bloodlines, had ultimately produced generations of royals, born frail or dying in infancy. Keeping the court in perpetual terror, Charles's childhood passed amid cold stone pillars and silent chambers filled with heavy sighs. He could not stand unaided until he was 8 years old, limp as a fallen leaf with every step guided by attendants. His speech only became somewhat coherent in adulthood, yet always carried a quaver and startle, as if each word cost him physical and mental anguish. The sight of a 4-year-old in lavish robes, deep in thought, sent a shiver through Madrid. From the moment of his accession, Charles II was unable to govern on his own. His mother, Queen Regent Mariana, and the chief ministers held real power, shielding the infant king amid factional struggles between Austrian and French parties. Both with direct stakes in Spanish affairs, Charles became a cultural symbol, embodying both the hope of preserving a mighty empire and the dread of a genetic legacy that threatened human suffering. In terms of achievements, Charles II left scant record of reform or military triumph. Instead, the image of a weakened monarch, easily swayed by external forces, underscored the tragedy of absolute power twisted by superstition and inbreeding. The court incessantly arranged dynastic marriages, first to Marie-Louise of Orléans, then to Maria Anna of Neuburg, in hopes of securing an heir, yet both queens remained childless. And the mysterious death of Marie-Louise in 1689 fueled whispers of assassination and political intrigue. Court life grew increasingly grim as priests prayed. Healers scoured the palace with potions and divinations for the ailing king. Incense, smoke, and holy water were meant to cleanse his soul. Yet the reality was bleak. Charles II was reduced to skin stretched over bones. Wax pale and hollow-eyed, Nights found him convulsing in Zeitzuras, growling between ragged breaths, forcing guards to rush in and unbind him. A fetid stench emanated from his body that even costly perfumes could not mask. Yet, despite his decrepit condition, Charles II sat upon the Spanish throne for 35 years. A span long enough to convulse Europe with a protracted succession crisis. He survived repeated attempts by French and Austrian agents to manipulate the crown, as each faction raised troops at the palace gates, throwing Madrid into fear. Nonetheless, the frail king endured as a battered emblem of the Habsburg dynasty. Finally, in the autumn of 1700, Charles II died at the age of 38, closing a dark chapter in Spanish history. His death not only ended the Habsburg line, but ignited the War of the Spanish Succession, a decade-long conflict that devastated the economy and reshaped the European balance of power. The life and turbulent childhood of Charles II, from his father's death and his mother's regency to the court's frantic quest for an heir, stand as a poignant testament to the price paid when power is guarded by closed bloodlines and superstition tramples reason. In his final, laboured breath echoed the sigh of an empire that once boasted the sun never sets. In the final weeks of 1700, Charles II's frail body teetered on the brink of collapse, emaciated to the point that his skin clung like parchment to protruding bones. He could no longer support himself without two attendants on either side, their arms steadying his unsteady frame. As he shuffled between bed and faint hopes of recovery, his jaw sagged, lips parted in a perpetual drool. Each laboured attempt at speech reduced to scarcely intelligible murmurs. Night times offered no comfort. Convulsions racked his limbs with sudden, violent jolts. His eyes snapped open in panic, only to betray no recognition of the doctors rushing to bind his thrashing wrists. Sleep eluded him for days on end, leaving behind a hollow-eyed spectre of the once glorious monarch. Within the palace's hushed corridors, a tense procession of royal physicians made their rounds, voices low as they confided in one another. They had bled him until his veins ran dry. Believing that withdrawing his tainted humours might restore balance, they administered potent purgatives and bitter herbal decoctions, each draught worse than the last, hoping the plants of the Indies or the apothecary's mortar might yet work a miracle. Yet every remedy proved futile. Charles's gaunt figure grew paler by light and paler by dark, as though his life force were a fading candle guttering in the draughty stone halls. As physical treatments dwindled into ineffectiveness, a more ominous solution emerged. Whispered suggestions of demonic influence slithered through the marble galleries. The Inquisition, still an austere instrument of ecclesiastical power in Spain, was summoned to assess reports of supernatural occurrences. Courtiers once preoccupied with protocol now spoke in awed tones of unearthly voices echoing through the king's chambers, of phantom shapes glimpsed at the edge of the lamplight. Even hardened generals, accustomed to the roar of cannon and the clamour of war, found themselves unnerved by tales of Charles cursing the air at the stroke of midnight. In the royal antechamber, ministers and prelates gathered under vaulted ceilings, carved with angels and demons in equal measure. Flickering candles cast long shadows that danced across tapestries depicting Spain's imperial triumphs. A cruel contrast to the present despair. Heartbeats quickened. As testimonies were taken, a palace chambermaid described seeing the king's eyes roll back into his head, his voice warbling in a tongue no scholar could translate. A guard swore he heard laughter inhuman, hollow, echoing down the silent corridors. These accounts fueled a growing conviction that mere medicine could not touch the affliction. Meanwhile, the Queen, Maria Anna, sat by Charles's bedside, with grief etched into every line of her face. Her once regal composure faltered as she watched each seizure contort her husband's body. She clutched his clammy hand, murmuring prayers into the dim air, seemingly unaware that the court's decisions were being made beyond the heavy drapes. In her eyes flickered both hope and terror. Hope that some unseen miracle would save her spouse. Terror that the very institution she served might condemn him as possessed. Father Antonio Mariscialla, chosen as chief exorcist, arrived with the solemnity of a man bearing the weight of souls. His crimson robes whispered against the stone floor as he approached the king's bed. Eyes alight with a mixture of piety and purpose, he carried in his hands a crucifix carved from olive wood and a vial of holy water said to be blessed by the Pope himself. Around him, acolytes arranged incense burners that released a dense, cloying smoke, filling the air with its sweet, choking perfume. That night, in the private chapel, turned makeshift exorcism chamber, the atmosphere crackled with tension. Soldiers in scarlet cloaks kept silent vigil at the door, muskets at rest but fingers twitching near triggers. Noble witnesses, dukes, marchionesses, and envoys occupied the choir stalls, their expressions a mixture of dread, fascination, and feigned decorum. The stone walls, once a sanctuary for whispered devotion, now bore witness to an extraordinary confrontation. Faith and fear, unleashed against an illness that no surgeon's blade could cure. As Father Mariscialla began the ritual intoning prayers in cold Latin that reverberated off the vaulted ceiling, Charles convulsed once more. He screamed, a sound that fractured the hush like a thunderclap, alternating between childish shrieks and low, guttural growls. The leather straps that bound him to the bed frame creaked under his struggling weight, drawing fresh gouts of sweat from his fevered skin. Acolytes splashed holy water onto his chest. It hissed and steamed, its chill bite only adding to his agony. Outside the chamber, the court hovered in uneasy silence. Each flare of candlelight illuminated faces drawn tight with anxiety. Some crossed themselves, fingers trembling. Others averted their gaze, unwilling to confront the sight of a king so transformed by suffering that he seemed scarcely human. Whispers spread like wildfire. Had Spain's finest physicians truly been outmatched by forces beyond nature, had royal blood, once seen as a divine blessing, become a conduit for something far darker? In those relentless hours, the boundaries between medicine and magic blurred. Physicians, now sidelined and silenced, watched from the shadows as clergy took centre stage. Their charts and tinctures lay abandoned on nearby tables, their learned musings drowned by the thunder of liturgical verses. Each moment of temporary calm, when Charles's breathing steadied and his eyes momentarily cleared, was heralded as a triumph of sacred ritual. Yet invariably, the king slipped back into his tortured stupor, as though the demons within him simply retreated to strike again. By morning's grey light, the outcome remained uncertain. The air still quivered with the incense's last tendrils, and Father Mariscialla's vestments bore the stain of both water and sweat. Charles, drained beyond measure, lay still, but for the shallow rise and fall of his chest. The court lingered in uneasy vigil. Would this night of exorcism mark a turning point? Or would it be remembered as the final act in a long tragedy? In that sombre dawn, as the first sliver of sunlight crept through stained glass windows, all who had watched waited with bated breath. The palace's cold stones held their secrets close. Yet in their silent mourning lay the echo of a king's final battle, a battle that neither scalpel nor sanctified water could ultimately resolve. In the weary hush that followed, the question on every lip was the same. Had they confronted the true source of Charles II's torment? Or had they only glimpsed a shadow of the horror that would soon define his last days? Late on a freezing October night, the great hall of the royal private apartments was transformed into an arena of ritual confrontation. Charles II lay bound to his gilt-framed bed by thick leather straps, his frail body drawn taut like a stringed instrument under tension. Father Antonio Mariscialla, the foremost exorcist of Spain, entered in solemn procession, his crimson chasuble whispering across the stone floor. In his hands, he carried a small, silver-bound missal of Latin prayers, a crystal vial of holy water blessed in Rome, and a censer brimming with frankincense. Acolytes clustered behind him, each holding tapering candles whose pale light trembled upon the vaulted ceiling. The ceremony began with Father Marishala's voice rising in measured cadence. In nomine Patris, et Filii, et Spiritus Sancti. Each syllable hung heavy in the frozen air as he sprinkled droplets of water across the king's chest, the liquid hissing upon contact with his fevered skin. The scent of burning incense curled in languid streams, mingling with the chill and the faint metallic tang of fear. Courtier duc, marquises, high-ranking prelates pressed into the gallery, drawn by a mixture of dread fascination and courtly duty. Musketeers in scarlet mantles stood guard at the door, their polished barrels catching occasional glints of candlelight. Suddenly, the king roared a sound that shattered the hush. His cry lurched between the high-pitched wail of a frightened child and the guttural growl of some ancient beast. Leather straps bit into his wrists as he thrashed, every sinew taut with the effort to break free. His attendants scrambled to hold him fast, their gloved hands slick with sweat and holy water. Father Marishala, undeterred, began a new litany, his words tumbling faster. More urgently, he invoked the archangels Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, to stand against the malignant spirit within the monarch's flesh. As each prayer landed upon Charles's ears, the king trembled violently, eyelids fluttering as if battling unseen visions. Flames danced atop the brass censers, casting flickering shadows that writhed across the tapestries depicting Spain's conquests. Every so often, Charles's lips cracked in half-formed words, fragments of Latin prayers mixed with cries in his native tongue. Courtiers leaned forward, straining to discern meaning in his agony, hoping for some sign that the exorcism was wresting control from the demon they believed tormented him. Father Marishala next uncovered a small nickel crucifix and pressed it against Charles's brow. The metal bit coldly into the king's fevered skin, eliciting another wave of convulsions. Acolytes dashed forward with towels, blotting perspiration from his temple, even as they kept the bedclothes from tangling him further. The exorcist then pressed a relic, a fragment of a saint's bone against Charles's heart, intoning a passage so low that only the immediate circle could hear: per hunc sacratissimum crucis potentium, exi ab hoc servo, DEI. With each repeated plea, the king's body writhed more fiercely. Leaves in a storm, his voice echoing against stone walls long accustomed to solemn worship rather than such visceral anguish. Between sessions, brief intervals of calm descended upon the chamber. Charles's chest heaved as he drew ragged breaths, beads of foam forming at the corner of his lips. For a fleeting instant, his gaze cleared. He seemed to recognize his attendants, blinking slowly as though surfacing from an ocean of torment. Courtiers dared a collective sigh, and even the musketeers relaxed their grip on weapons. Father Marishala, lantern in hand, studied the king's face for signs of demonic recoil. The hush that followed these moments carried its own weight, a fragile hope that perhaps the ritual had succeeded. But nearly every time, the peace shattered. Charles's body convulsed once more, spasms racking his limbs, as if some invisible force sought to tear him apart from within. The leather straps groaned under the strain, and the bed trembled like a leaf in the wind. The incense burned low, its sweet smoke now thick and suffocating. Acolytes shuffled forward to relight candles, their hands unsteady as they tried to keep the chamber from plunging into complete darkness. Despite the ceremony's intensity, Charles's neurological state remained unchanged. He lingered at the brink of consciousness, his mind a fractured prism reflecting alternating moments of lucidity and abyssal confusion. Each lucidity, those brief instances when he seemed to grasp his surroundings, was a cruel tease. He would whisper a single coherent sentence, a plea for mercy, or a fragment of a prayer, only to lapse again into guttural moans. The bravest courtiers dared to hope that the malignant presence had been driven back, but Father Maréchal's weary eyes betrayed the truth. The exorcism had become as much a symbol of desperation as a remedy. By the ceremony's end, the royal physicians, once sidelined, emerged from the shadows to examine the king's battered body. They noted bruises at the strap marks, the sheen of sweat drying on his paleness, and the tremor that coursed through his frame like a final mocking testament to their own impotence. Incense smoke clung to his hair, and his breath came in shallow gasps, as though the ritual had drained rather than restored his vitality. In the grey dawn that followed, the exhausted assembly dispersed, carrying with them the grim certainty that neither prayer nor potion could unmake the damage wrought by decades of genetic ruin. The exorcism, intended as a last beacon of hope, had instead crystallized the empire's collapse into a single night of horror. It became a legend, whispered in the corridors of power, the night when a king's suffering was laid bare for all to see, and when the mightiest physicians and the holiest priests alike proved unable to save him from the darkness within. On the first day of November, in the year 1700, the fragile life of Charles II finally ebbed away. Word of his passing travelled like wildfire across European courts, triggering the long-feared succession war before a single tolling bell had silenced its echoes. Yet for the moment, in Madrid's hushed streets, all attention turned to the solemn rites that would attend the Habsburg king's final journey. Preparations began almost immediately. In the twilight of his death chamber, Señor Courtier-Duke, marquises, and high-ranking prelates assembled to arrange the funeral cortege. A council of state met in austere formality within the Alcazar's vaulted hall, candlelight dancing on tapestries that celebrated Spain's imperial glory. Plans were drawn. The body would lie in state for 3 nights upon a marble bier in the royal chapel of the palace. Draped in deep purple velvet, embroidered with golden Habsburg eagles, the king's funeral canopy would stand on 12 carved columns, symbolizing the 12 provinces of Spain. And the dirge would be led by the Archbishop of Toledo himself, accompanied by 1,000 choristers drawn from cathedral and court. On the morning of November 1st, the royal funeral procession assembled. Horse-drawn hearses, lacquered black and silver, were adorned with crimson plumes and ashen wreaths. Knights in mourning cloaks of sable and ermine capes filed past the bier, each placing a single white rose upon the polished oak casket. Foreign ambassadors from France, Austria, England, and the Low Countries were present, each a witness, each an observer, each an agent of shifting alliances that would soon rip the continent apart. The military guard of honor, 2 battalions of regular infantry, whose uniforms still carried the fresh mark of Bourbon reform, presented their arms and fired silent volleys into the still air. Yet even amid the grand ceremony, whispers of unease flitted through the throng. Some noted that the king's face, embalmed beyond all recognition, seemed unnaturally drawn, as though the mortician had hastened his work. Courtiers claimed that during the lying in state, faint moans issued from the covered bier, prompting guards to place additional lanterns and pray for the monarch's eternal rest. A noblewoman fainted at the foot of the coffin, insisting she saw the late king's eyes blink beneath the shroud. Though no physician could confirm her vision, such murmurs spread rapidly, casting an odd tension alongside the practiced elegance of the cortege. The funeral mass itself took place within the dim grandeur of the royal chapel. Stained glass windows filtered grey daylight onto rows of bowed heads, while the choir intoned requiems that rolled like distant thunder through the nave. Archbishop Don Francisco de la Mora delivered a eulogy that touched on Charles's sufferings, his long years of affliction, the heavy burden of his lineage, and the faith that sustained him amid the cruelest torments. Yet certain passages struck uneasily at the assembled when the archbishop spoke of leaving behind more questions than answers. Ambassadors shifted in their stalls, sensing the undercurrents of political upheaval. When the service concluded, the cortege processed back through the palace's great courtyard, now lined with torches whose flames danced on the cold stone. The casket was loaded onto a barge at the palace's canal lock, to be carried under low bridges toward the monastery church of the Escorial, the traditional resting place of Spanish kings, along the narrow waterway. Citizens pressed close to the banks, some scattering flower petals, others cross-legged in prayer. Bands of minstrels played dirges on viols and lutes, though their strings sometimes snapped under the chill autumn air, leaving plaintive silences in the wake of each broken note. As dusk fell, the procession reached the steps of El Escorial. Monks in black habits chanted the Office of the Dead, their voices echoing off cloistered archways. A final benediction was pronounced above the tomb alcove, requiescat in pace. The prior intoned, his voice quavering with emotion. The marble sarcophagus, carved with the Habsburg coat of arms, lay open for a brief moment before the heavy lid was lowered, sealing Charles II away in his final resting place. But even here, in this seat of eternal repose, something felt amiss. A sudden gust of wind snuffed torches in the dim corridor, plunging the assembled into flickering darkness. Courtiers gasped and drew cloaks tighter, some clutching crucifixes, as though warding off restless spirits. When the lamps were yet again lit, palace records note that a dark stain, as though spilled ink, marked the marble floor beside the coffin, though no source of such substance could be found, whether blood from an unseen fracture or simply resin from the coffin's wood. No one could say. The stain was swiftly scrubbed, but rumours endured that the final exorcism had been incomplete, that the demon which plagued the king still lingered in shadowed corners. In the days that followed, mourning bells tolled across Spain, and the court slipped into a period of guarded silence. Yet behind closed doors, nobles whispered of the king's ghost, of rattling chains and distant cries that haunted empty chambers. As emissaries hurried to announce succession claims, and armies prepared for war, the memory of Charles's tortured end and unsettling funeral lingered like a half-remembered nightmare, a portent of the turmoil that would soon engulf Europe. And so, amid the flicker of torchlight and the echo of psalms, Charles II of Spain was laid to rest. Yet his final ceremonies, steeped in grandeur and shadowed by strange occurrences, served as both testament and warning that the weight of a crown, the secrets of a life, and the mysteries of death itself can combine to haunt the living long after the sovereign has breathed his last. Amid the solemn atmosphere of the funeral rites, the royal physicians and renowned scholars meticulously recorded each step of Charles II's post-mortem examination, aiming to paint the most comprehensive portrait of the Habsburg genetic catastrophe. They unearthed 5 horrifying findings hidden within the emperor's body, each arranged in order from the exterior inward, allowing us to gradually uncover the severity of each lesion. Now, let us proceed together to the very first revelation they discovered. First, a heart no larger than a child's fist. Late in the autumn of 1700, long after the candles had guttered and the last echoes of lamentation had faded from the palace corridors, the royal physicians turned their attention to the most astonishing of all discoveries, the king's heart. When they carefully removed the organ from its vaulted chamber, they found a structure scarcely larger than the clenched fist of a child, perhaps no more than the size of a small boy's hand. Imagine a heart no bigger than that of an 8-year-old. Yet this tiny muscle had miraculously kept Charles II alive for nearly 40 years under the unrelenting strain of disease and deformity. The physicians stood in stunned silence as they beheld its grotesque form. The tissue was desiccated and shrunken, its surface blackened and leathery in appearance, as though it had been left to bake in the Mediterranean sun until it dripped all its life's vitality away. In contrast to the plump, resilient organ they expected, this heart looked more like a fragment of charred wood than the supple muscle needed to pump life-giving blood through a man's veins. One senior surgeon whispered to his colleague that it was a miracle this remnant had ever beaten at all. On the dissection table beneath the flickering torchlight, The heart's chambers lay collapsed and distorted. The ventricles, those powerful pumping chambers vital for propelling blood through the body, were almost entirely contracted. Their walls thickened in places and paper-thin in others. Each contraction could at best move a mere trickle of fluid, yet Charles's body had somehow endured, relying on this skeletal remnant to sustain his organs through decades of degeneration. The idea that such a nearly non-functional organ had served him for 38 years defied every lesson of anatomy they thought they knew. Hearts of similar size, they knew, belonged to children or small animals. In any medical text of the era, a heart this diminished would be considered dead by every definition. Yet from the moment of his birth, Charles had been endowed with this extraordinary anomaly, a heart so compromised that his court physicians had long feared it might give out at any moment. The tissues themselves bore the scars of chronic ischemia, patches of fibrous scar tissue where muscle cells had perished from lack of oxygen, interspersed with areas of brittle calcification that cracked at the gentlest touch. In one quadrant of the myocardium, a dark stain hinted at an old infarct, a silent heart attack that likely passed unnoticed in his childhood thanks to his muted symptoms and his sheltered life behind palace walls. The Crown's chief medical officer, poring over his notes by candlelight, recorded that the coronary vessels, the delicate arteries tasked with feeding the heart itself, were choked with sclerotic plaques. Their lumens narrowed to ribbons. Blood flow, they deduced, had been chronically impaired, causing repeated mini-infarctions throughout his life. Yet the king had persisted. Each feeble beat had demanded more effort than any normal heart could muster. And still, he lived on, sustained by sheer will, and the ministrations of countless physicians. When the autopsy report reached the broader medical community, it sent shockwaves through Europe's anatomical schools. Students and professors alike marveled that a man could survive with so little functional cardiac muscle. In lectures and treatises that followed, this peppercorn heart, as some anatomists dubbed it, became emblematic of the catastrophic toll that centuries of inbreeding had taken upon the Habsburg line. They debated whether any modern technique could rectify such a condition, or whether, indeed, any physician could ever save a patient with a heart so ravaged. In that pale, echoing chamber, the physicians closed the king's chest and stepped back, their thoughts heavy with the implications. The tiny, charred heart had borne the full burden of a monarchy's hopes and fears, pumping against impossible odds until the very end. It was more than a medical curiosity. It was a testament to human fragility and the limits of power, a somber reminder that no crown can conquer the quiet tyranny of biology. Second, finding lungs engorged with fluid and necrotic tissue. As the royal surgeons moved from the heart to the chest cavity, they encountered an even more harrowing spectacle: Charles II's lungs, swollen and sodden with fluid, their spongy tissue giving way under the slightest pressure. Under the flicker of torchlight, the pleural sacs burst with the weight of accumulated liquids, an ominous puddle pooling beneath the breastbone. This was no mere congestion from a passing cold. The surgeons noted that large portions of the pulmonary parenchyma had succumbed to necrosis. The living tissue rotted away, leaving cavernous voids where oxygen exchange could never occur. Lying supine on the marble table, the king's chest was opened to reveal lungs that looked more like overripe fruit, bruised and collapsing inward. Each lobe, once pliant and airy, now bore dark, waterlogged patches that oozed afoul, turbid serum at the incision's tip. The fluid's consistency was greasy, tinged with blood, and the unmistakable scent of decay. Courtiers pressed closer at the edge of the chamber, having been warned that this sight would be far worse than the shrunken heart they breathed through handkerchiefs, the acrid odour choking their nostrils. In their notes, the physicians described multiple cavities, some the size of small apples, where lung tissue had literally liquefied. These pockets of necrosis had left only thin walls of scarred connective tissue, collapsing in on themselves like deflated bellows. The king's wheezing, so often attributed to general weakness or perhaps nervous affliction, now found its grim explanation. With so little functioning lung and with coughs that likely expelled nothing but fetid fluid, Charles had laboured for years just to draw breath. Each inhale a struggle against the weight of his own failing organs. The necrotic zones extended deep into the bronchioles, blocking airways and preventing any clear passage of air. One surgeon gently probed a collapsed bronchus and withdrew a slimy plug of purulent material. Congealed and tinged a sickly yellow, they speculated that this chronic infection must have plagued the king since childhood. A festering wound that never healed beneath the surface. In the days before germ theory, the cause remained elusive. But the effects were undeniable. The king's voice, already slurred by his malformed jaw and large tongue, became a series of rasping whispers, intelligible only when he forced himself to speak through ragged breaths. As the anatomists peeled back the layers, they found that the visceral pleura, the delicate membrane enveloping each lung, had thickened into a dense, fibrous sheath, calcified in parts, as though stems of ice had formed around the organ. When one physician attempted to lift a lobe, it tore away with a wet, splintering sound, revealing the hideous scar tissue beneath. The stethoscopic percussion tests they had conducted weeks earlier, detecting dullness and absent resonance, now made perfect sense. Where sound should have bounced back clear, it had instead vanished, swallowed by the pools of fluid and solidified decay. The royal chief physician, scribbling furiously in his ledger, noted that no amount of bleeding or poultices could have remedied this internal rot. He wrote that any hopes of the king recovering his strength had been futile. A body cannot survive when its breath of life is held hostage by its own necrotic flesh. Ailing noble spectators exchanged grim looks. The Habsburg scion had spent his entire reign in a state of near asphyxiation, a living ghost gasping for air. Yet in life, Charles II had persisted. The surgeons speculated that he must have compensated with shallow, rapid breathing, drawing just enough oxygen to keep his vital organs heart, brain, liver barely functional. Perhaps opium or other demulcent remedies had dulled his awareness of the smothering chest tightness, permitting brief intervals of relative comfort. But beneath the veneer of palace pageantry, every step he took and every word he uttered exacted a terrible toll on his ravaged lungs. When the findings were later presented to Europe's medical academies, the concept of pulmonary necrosis of this scale stunned learned audiences. In anatomical theatres far from Spain, students whispered that no living patient could have endured such destruction for so long. Textbooks would later cite Charles II's case as an extreme example of end-stage lung disease, a morbid curiosity that underscored the limits of 17th century medicine. Returning to the chamber's manifest gloom, the surgeons closed the king's thoracic cavity. Their gloves stained with dark ichor, they stepped away in solemn silence, burdened by the knowledge that the crown's proud bearer had been hollowed out from within, his life sustained only by the feeblest whisper of breath. The image of those fluid-filled, necrotic lungs became a lasting emblem of the Habsburg tragedy, a reminder that even royal blood cannot escape the ravages of disease, and that the finest physicians may stand helpless before the quiet tyranny of internal decay. Third, finding brain atrophied with cysts and old hemorrhages. In the quiet aftermath of the king's harrowing lung examination, the physicians turned their attention to his brain, an organ that, despite its crowning importance, lay diminished and wounded. Carefully lifting the heavy skull cap, they exposed a cavity narrower than expected, the cranial vault echoing with a hollow whisper, as if mourning its own emptiness. What they revealed beneath the bone was a brain no larger than that of a child. Its mass, constrained by a lifetime of stunted growth. Gone was the full, rounded gyri and sulci that mark mature development. In their place lay shallow furrows and flattened ridges, as though someone had gently pressed a sculptor's clay before it could fully set. Sections of grey matter had contracted into thin sheets, While white matter, once a complex network of fibers, had receded into wisps, the overall volume, measured against any standard of adult anatomy, spoke of severe atrophy, a mind confined by its very vessel. But more disturbing than size alone were the dark pockets scattered through its tissue cysts where fluid had pooled in ancient caverns, remnants of developmental anomalies that likely formed before the king even drew his first breath. These cavities varied in size, some no larger than a marble, others approaching the breadth of a child's fingertip. The cyst walls, thin and translucent, bore evidence of repeated expansions and contractions, suggesting that they had waxed and waned throughout Charles's life, exerting pressure on surrounding neurons like subtle, persistent tides. Among these cysts lay the stains of long-healed hemorrhages, yellow-brown smears, and rust-colored streaks marked areas where tiny blood vessels had once burst, leaving behind old clots that the body had gradually dissolved. Surgeons noted patches of gliosis scar tissue woven through the cortex, evidence that each bleed had triggered a localized healing response, replacing lost nerve cells with dense, non-functional fibers. In the mind of a normal man, Zook lesions might manifest as situs, memory lapses, or cognitive slowdown. For Charles Dew, they formed part of a larger tapestry of neural impairment that left him vulnerable to fits, confusion, and unpredictable behavior as they traced their fingers across the brain's surface. One physician murmured that no textbook described such a landscape. The combination of widespread atrophy, multiple cysts, and layered hemorrhagic scars pointed unequivocally to severe genetic disruption, an end result of centuries of close kin unions within the Habsburg lineage. Over time, deleterious, recessive genes, left unchecked by outside blood, had alike throttled neural development and predisposed fragile vessels to rupture. The team observed that the lateral ventricles, the fluid-filled chambers that cushion the brain, were abnormally enlarged, as if compensating for lost tissue. Where these cavities should have measured a few millimeters in width, they had ballooned to several centimeters, a silent testament to the brain's shrinkage. In life, this condition would have manifested as hydrocephalus ex vacuo, an excess of cerebrospinal fluid, not from overproduction, but from the brain receding around it, leaving more space to fill. One senior anatomist, his quill shaking as he recorded each detail by lantern light, noted that these findings explained much of the king's erratic mental state. His frequent vacant stares, his inability to follow complex conversations, and his occasional bouts of childlike laughter could now be understood as the behavior of a mind struggling to function within a compromised organ. The monarch who had sat on the throne as a boy for decades had done so with a brain under siege from within, its potential never fully realized. When word of this neurological revelation reached the faculties of Europe, it sent ripples of anxious curiosity through the halls of medicine and philosophy alike. The idea that a sovereign's capacity for reason and governance could be literally hollowed out by heredity forced scholars to reconsider assumptions about royal prerogative and divine right. If a king's brain could be so diminished, what did that say of the legitimacy of his decrees? Debates ensued in lecture theatres from Padua to Paris. Could a monarch with such anatomical impairment truly exercise free will? Or had his ministers been the true architects of policy all along? As the palace surgeons closed the skull and rejoined the other physicians in the candlelit antechamber, a sombre awe hung over them. The image of the tiny, scarred brain remained etched in their memories, a poignant emblem of the human cost of dynastic obsession. No crown, no matter how glittering, could stave off the slow erosion of flesh and nerve wrought by generations of inbreeding. In those hushed moments, as they set aside their instruments and prepared to record their final judgment, the doctors understood that they had not merely documented anatomical curiosities, but uncovered a profound truth, that the mind so central to identity and power could become the ultimate casualty of a lineage's relentless drive to preserve itself. And in that realization lay the tragic irony of Charles II's life, a king bound by blood to rule an empire, yet burdened by a brain that never fully wakened to its responsibilities. Fourth, finding large kidney stones and severe skeletal deformities. As the dissection advanced beyond the brain, the royal physicians turned their attention to the abdomen and skeletal framework, only to uncover further testimony to Charles II's tragic constitution. With careful incisions, they exposed the peritoneal cavity and peeled back membranes to reveal a pair of kidneys scarred by chronic distress. Upon palpation, the surgeons identified not one, but 3 sizable calculi kidney stones, each the size of a walnut. These hard, crystalline masses had formed slowly over years of impaired renal function, their jagged edges chafing the delicate internal lining and spawning relentless cycles of pain and bleeding. When one stone was carefully extracted, its surface gleamed like ivory, pockmarked with fossil-like grooves that mapped an unseen history of mineral accretion. The physicians noted that each calculus occupied a substantial fraction of the renal pelvis, blocking the flow of urine and forcing pressurized fluid back into the organ's fine tubules. This backflow would have led to repeated bouts of infection, inflammation, and relentless agony, an invisible torture that Charles endured in silence. Masked by courtly decorum, the nearest surgeon surmised that, in life, the king must have experienced spasms, so excruciating they bent him double, his breath stuttering in ragged gasps until the torment subsided. Beyond the kidneys, attention shifted to the remains of Charles's skeleton, preserved by the cold air of the dissection chamber. When the vertebral column was unshrouded, it revealed an unmistakable lateral curvature, scoliosis of shocking degree, the spine bent in an shaped arc, compressing ribs unevenly and tilting the torso to one side. Vertebrae, wedged and misaligned, bore the marks of chronic strain and compensatory remodeling. In life, this spinal distortion would have hobbled the king's posture, forcing him to lean on attendants or crutches, each step a precarious negotiation to keep his torso upright. Further examination uncovered misshapen ribs. Several arcs protruded sharply, while others lay flattened against the chest wall. These deformations, likely congenital or exacerbated by the persistent pulmonary illness, would have constricted lung expansion even further, compounding the difficulty of breathing that had already been so dire. When the surgeons gently lifted one misshapen rib, it cracked audibly, as though the brittle bone had been starved of normal marrow and subjected to decades of abnormal mechanical pressure. Finally, the mandible presented its own grim testament. The lower jaw jutted forward at an unnatural angle, creating a pronounced prognathism that distorted the king's facial profile. The mandibular bone was twisted and asymmetrical, a permanent testament to the Habsburg jaw for which the dynasty had become infamous. This deformity, paired with a cleft palate and an oversized tongue, rendered mastication a near impossible task. Surgeons found wear patterns on the teeth, flat planes and chipped enamel indicating that Charles ground his food against bone or forced it down through grinding motions that, at best, produced only the thinnest gruel. In life, even swallowing would have required effort, each bite a battle against his own skeletal misalignment. The cumulative effect of these findings painted a grim picture. The internal stones had bleached and scarred his kidneys, robbing him of comfort and health. The twisted spine and warped ribs had compounded respiratory distress. The misshapen jaw had turned eating into a chore of reluctance and pain. Charles II's body, fragile as it was, had borne these burdens silently, his demeanour of stoic resignation, masking a lifetime of physical torment. In the candlelit antechamber, the physicians recorded every detail with heavy hearts. They recognized that no poultice, no bleeding, no religious rite could have remedied such structural ruin. They had not merely catalogued anatomical curiosities, but witnessed the relentless toll of genetic catastrophe on human flesh and bone. Each stone that had lodged in a kidney, every vertebra bent into unnatural curvature, and the jaw frozen in its forward thrust served as chapters in a harrowing chronicle of inherited folly. When these revelations reached the halls of medical academia, they reinforced the cautionary lesson of Charles II's autopsy that the proudest dynasties, if governed by an obsession with bloodline purity, could condemn their heirs to unspeakable suffering. No kingdom's glory could eclipse the simple truth that human bodies, however regal their lineage, remain subject to the unforgiving laws of biology. Thus, as the surgeons closed the abdominal cavity and set the bones aside, they felt the weight of both professional duty and personal sorrow. The large kidney stones and skeletal deformities they uncovered were not mere curiosities, but indelible proof of a life spent in quiet agony, an agony that even the highest honours could not mask. And so, in that dimly lit chamber, the final sombre lesson of Charles II's autopsy was written in mineral, and bone power may crown the flesh, but it cannot free it from nature's inexorable decrees. Fifth finding: skull, engorged with excess cerebrospinal fluid hydrocephalus. With the abdominal cavity closed and the skeleton set aside, the royal physicians turned once more to the cranium, preparing for what they both feared and anticipated: the examination of Charles II's brain case under conditions of elevated intracranial pressure. Under the wavering light of their oil lamps, they gently sawed through the skull, mindful that beneath the bone lay a hidden reservoir of fluid that had built up over decades. When the parietal and frontal bones were lifted, a bale, translucent liquid welled forth, spilling like a slow tide around the brain's surface. The surgeons had expected some degree of fluid after all. A small amount of cerebrospinal fluid is normal, but the volume here was extraordinary. The cerebral cortex appeared compressed, pushed into folded ridges, as the fluid filled the ventricles beyond their normal capacity. The anterior fontanelle had long since closed in life, of course, but in death, the vault of his skull resembled a bottle overfilled, its contents forced into every available cavity. Surgeons measured the collected fluid, several hundred milliliters. Where a healthy adult might hold but a fraction of that, they noted that the increased pressure must have raised his intracranial pressure to dangerous peaks, tormenting him with unrelenting, throbbing headaches that no potion or bleed could relieve. The pressure had stretched sensitive pain fibers in the dura mater, eliciting waves of agony that Charles likely endured in private, away from curious courtiers. A senior anatomist, his voice hushed, recorded that such tension could also trigger the violent seizures noted in palace records, muscle spasms and uncontrollable jerks, as the brain's electrical circuits misfired under duress. Underneath the fluid lake, the brain tissue was pallid and flattened. Gyri were pressed into shallow valleys, their usual undulations smoothed by years of pressure. The surgeons observed that neurons along the cortical surface must have been destroyed, or at least functionally impaired by chronic compression. Memory centers in the hippocampus would have borne the brunt, explaining contemporary accounts of the king's frequent confusion and inability to recall simple conversations. Without microscopes or modern staining techniques, they nonetheless recognized that such structural damage could only erode cognition and personality over time. When a surgeon gently inserted a probe into the lateral ventricle, it sank easily through the fluid, indicating an enlarged ventricular system. This destructive expansion, known today as hydrocephalus ex vacuo, occurs when brain tissue atrophies and cerebrospinal fluid fills the resulting space. But in Charles's case, it was clear that repeated insults, perhaps from old hemorrhages and developmental malformations, had amplified the condition. Each pulse of the choroid plexus, generating cerebrospinal fluid, would have further increased the brain's hydrostatic burden. Physicians imagined the torment hours spent staggering through palace corridors, massaging his temples for relief, nights spent screaming as pressure surged behind his eyes. No wonder he had lain awake for days, unable to find rest. In the absence of effective analgesics, he must have begged quietly in his bedchamber for water, balm, or some solace for the ceaseless pounding in his skull. The fluid's colour was a milky opalescence, tinged faintly with red, hinting at microhemorrhages where capillaries had ruptured under pressure. When the surgeons drained a specimen into a basin, it ran thickly, leaving a slight sediment of proteinaceous debris, evidence of long-standing inflammation and breakdown of the blood-brain barrier. One physician remarked that in life, Charles might have exhibited symptoms of papilledema, swelling of the optic disc, leading to vision blurring or transient blindness during pressure spikes. As word of this finding circulated among Europe's medical circles, the notion of a king suffering from hydrocephalus captivated scholars. It was unlike any textbook description of head injury or simple fever-induced delirium. Here was proof that heredity and physiology could conspire to drown the mind in its own protecting fluid. A cruel irony that the very substance meant to cushion the brain had become its executioner. Back in the dissection chamber, after they had poured off the excess fluid and dried the cortical surface, the surgeons gently replaced the brain, the pale pia mater now almost glued to the underside of the skull cap. They noted in their journals that no scalpel nor remedy could have reversed such entrenched pressure dynamics. The only relief in life, a shunt to drain fluid, was centuries away. As the chamber fell into reflection, the exhausted physicians recognized that this fifth discovery, excess cerebrospinal fluid and its crushing effects, offered the most poignant explanation yet for Charles's relentless physical and cognitive decline. His throne may have been gilded, his court splendid, but inside his skull lay a watery tomb where thoughts were smothered and pain ruled supreme. In the end, the crown atop his head was overshadowed by the invisible weight bearing down from within, an eternal reminder that even kings cannot escape the unyielding laws of nature. Having documented the heart, lungs, brain, skeleton, and fluid overload in the skull, the physicians turned at last to Charles II's abdominal organs, only to confront the most macabre revelation of all. As they reflected back the slices of peritoneum, they found viscera already in a state of decay, unbefitting a body so freshly deceased. The stomach lining was ulcerated and blackened, its tissue friable to the touch. The intestines, rather than pink and glistening, appeared mottled and soft, as though starting to dissolve from within. Under the cold glare of their lanterns, the surgeons noted that even before rigor mortis had fully set in, certain organs bore the unmistakable signs of putrefaction. The liver, normally a robust, reddish-brown wedge, had taken on a dull grey hue, its edges ragged and soft. A faint but unmistakable odour, sweet, sickly, and repulsive, hovered in the chamber. Despite all efforts to mask it with lavender and rosemary, one physician, covering his nose with a cloth, murmured that he had seen no such decay in any other cadaver, even 1 day beyond death. When the large intestine was opened, a dark, foul-smelling fluid poured forth, as if the colon had begun to self-digest before the king's last breath had even faded. The small intestine was studded with patches of ulceration and necrotic slough, and the mesentery, the thin tissue binding the bowels, was distended with bloody exudate. Under gentle pressure, the walls of the intestines yielded a greyish liquid that clung to the scalpels and ran off in rivulets, staining the white marble table in grotesque starkness. The gallbladder, far from the pearly sac they expected, was thickened and opaque, its bile hardened into crystalline deposits that resembled lime. When pried open, it crunched like burnt sugar beneath the forceps. The gallstones themselves were brittle, no more than chipped fragments of calcium, but they had left the surrounding ducts scarred and constricted. Surgeons concluded that Charles must have suffered repeated bouts of biliary colic and inflammation pain intense enough to pull him from sleep and leave him clutching his side in agony. Attention then shifted to the pancreas, often overlooked, yet vital to digestion. When the grotesque gland was exposed, its tissue appeared larded with hemorrhagic spots, dark purplish stains where blood vessels had burst under pressure. The parenchyma, rather than the uniform lobules of a healthy organ, was riddled with soft, friable areas that crumbled under the lightest touch. Observers recorded that the king may well have been afflicted by chronic pancreatitis, an inflammation that would have sapped his strength and left him prone to sudden, excruciating abdominal spasms. The spleen, too, had swollen to twice its normal size, its capsule taut and glistening. On incision, it erupted in a shower of dark, clotted blood, suggesting that the fragile organ had been under persistent pressure, perhaps from portal hypertension caused by his liver's decay. One attending scholar noted that the spleen's engorgement likely contributed to his chronic fatigue, anemia, and bruising, a trifecta of symptoms, recorded in court diaries but never medically explained. What truly unsettled the physicians, however, was the state of the peritoneal cavity itself. Rather than clear serous fluid, the cavity was half filled with a turbid, straw-coloured liquid, heavy with suspended protein and cellular debris. This acidic fluid, long trapped within the abdomen, explained the distended belly and the king's constant discomfort. In life, such ascites would have caused him to waddle with each painful step, his gait unsteady as though he carried a hidden water bag at his midsection. Surgeons speculated that this advanced putrefaction began even before death, an indication that the balance between life and decay had tipped long earlier. The notion that internal organs could commence rotting within a living man shocked them more than anything. It suggested circulatory collapse, so complete that tissues had begun to self-digest in a bloodstream devoid of oxygen and nourishment. One senior physician, voice heavy, noted that even the foul airs of the autopsy room paled compared to the stench he recalled from the bedside in those final days. By the time the surgeons had catalogued each putrefied fragment, they realized they had observed the end stage of catastrophic systemic failure. No poultice or prayer could have prevented such decomposition. The king's entire digestive tract and accessory organs had collapsed from inherited frailty and chronic disease. This final finding drove home the tragedy. In stark relief, Charles II's immortal legacy was not triumph or reform, but a body laid waste, internally rotting while the world watched. When these notes reached Europe's medical symposiums, they were met with hushed disbelief. Scholars debated whether any living patient could endure such internal decay. The term living cadaver began to surface in anatomical circles, a king whose organs had begun to betray him, even as his throne still stood in that dimly lit chamber. As the physicians closed the final incisions and reflected on the sixth discovery, they understood that the true horror lay not in a single failing organ, but in the cascade of collapse. The putrefying stomach, the necrotic intestines, the hemorrhagic glands all spoke to a human vessel, abandoned by biology. And so, the last lesson of Charles II's autopsy was written in the clamp of a scalpel, and the notes of trembling scribes that no crown can protect against the inexorable advance of decay, and that a dynasty's greatest folly may be the very blood that binds it. As the final echoes of the autopsy faded into the still air of the dissection chamber, the physicians and scholars gathered their notes with heavy hearts. They had borne witness to the tragic collapse of a monarch's body from crown to core. 6 revelations of degeneration so profound that they seemed to define the very downfall of his dynasty. Yet while those silent halls replayed the last gasp of Charles II's living decay, beyond the palace walls the world was already moving toward a different kind of collapse, the collapse of order across Europe. Within hours of the king's death on the 1st of November, in the year 1700, dispatches flew from the courts of Paris and Vienna. Louis XIV hurried to exalt his grandson, Philip V's, claim to the Spanish crown, invoking a contested will said to have been signed in Charles's final moments of lucidity. Not to be outdone, Emperor Leopold, the first of the Holy Roman Empire, advanced the rights of his son, Archduke Charles, denouncing any testament born of a dying king's fevered throat. Each claimant laid down formal protests, official letters stamped with seals of state and mobilized regiments behind them. The stage was set for a conflict that would draw battle lines not only across the Iberian Peninsula, but across all of Christendom. By the 6th of November, barely a week after the funeral cortege had processed along Madrid's silent streets, the first clash erupted in the marshes and riverbanks of the Spanish Netherlands. There, in the cold dawn mist, Austrian dragoons and French foot soldiers traded musket volleys amid low-lying fields and windmill-guarded paths. Commanders on both sides believed that control of this buffer region would determine the larger war's ebb and flow. The gun smoke mingled with the morning fog as cavalry charges thundered across sodden earth, leaving both armies bloodied and unbowed. Meanwhile, across the Channel, news of the opening salvos reached London and The Hague with alarming speed. England and the Dutch Republic, long uneasy partners, united only by fear of Bourbon ambition, decided almost in unison to side with the Austrian cause. In hastily convened councils, statesmen argued that if France and Spain were ever joined under a single Bourbon king, the balance of power on the continent would tip irreversibly. They feared not only for the security of the Low Countries, but for the safety of their own trading fleets, whose routes through the Mediterranean and Atlantic would suddenly lie under threat. Within days, British and Dutch fleets sailed to reinforce Habsburg positions, while regiments mustered at ports in Sussex and North Holland, banners snapping in the wind. In Madrid, the new Spanish court under Philip V braced for war. French advisors drilled local militia in shock tactics borrowed from Versailles. Spanish nobles swore fealty to their Bourbon king, hoping to preserve their privileges against an Austrian overhaul. Cavalry regiments that had once paraded in triumph before Charles were now remounted for the coming struggle, their glimmering cuirasses reflecting the flickering torchlight of assembled banners. As armies mobilized in Europe, the conflict spread its tendrils across the oceans. Gibraltar, that rocky sentinel at the entrance to the Mediterranean, instantly became a prize for any fleet daring enough to challenge it. The British and Dutch squadrons blockaded the strait, while French ships patrolled the Bay of Biscay, seeking to intercept Spanish galleons laden with American silver. Islands such as Minorca and Sardinia saw garrisons hastily reinforced, forts buttressed, and gun batteries manned against possible amphibious assault. Further west, in the Caribbean and North America, colonial governors read the alarms raised by maritime raiders. French privateers, authorized by letters of marque, stalked the shipping lanes off Hispaniola and Jamaica, seizing merchantmen and terrorizing coastal plantations. English and Dutch corsairs answered in kind, their frigates chasing French prize ships toward New Amsterdam and Charleston, carrying away sugar, tobacco, and enslaved laborers as spoils. The calms of colonial life shattered beneath the roar of cannon and the cry of cutlasses, as remote trading posts found themselves on the front lines of an imperial contest. Inside Spain's own provinces, the war worked its ruin. In Catalonia and Valencia, where suspicion of Bourbon rule ran deep, local lords raised revolt in the name of the Austrian Archduke. Bands of irregulars raided supply convoys, burned distilleries, and sacked villages perceived to harbour Bourbon sympathizers. In Castile and Andalusia, peasants struggled under the weight of new levies to fund Philip's armies, and guerrilla bands ambushed tax collectors and requisition parties. The Spanish heartland, once secure in its Habsburg inheritance, fractured into a patchwork of loyalties and strife. Amid this sprawling conflict, diplomacy continued in whispered hallways. Envoys from Berlin, Venice, and the Papal States navigated shifting alliances, negotiating local truces, even as they prepared for broader campaigns. Treaties were proposed, only to collapse under fresh demands. Letters promising neutrality vanished when declarations of war thundered across borders. The war became a tempest in both ink and steel, a trial by diplomacies as much as by battalions. As the year turned to 1701 and 1702, the war's contours remained fluid. Frontiers moved back and forth across the Low Countries. Sieges gripped coastal fortresses. Fleets duelled in narrow seas. The European great powers found themselves locked in a bitter choreography of alliance and enmity, each afraid that a single misstep would unleash Bourbon dominion or Austrian encirclement. Thus, from Charles II's deathbed in a cold Madrid chamber to the cannon fire ringing out across Europe and the Atlantic, the War of the Spanish Succession unfolded as a grand tragedy of dynastic ambition. It would endure for more than a decade, shaping the map of continents and the fortunes of millions. Yet at its heart lay the memory of a frail king whose body, diseased and deformed, had sparked a conflict that would test the very limits of power and survival across the known world. As the war pressed into its second year, the waters surrounding the Rock of Gibraltar became the stage for one of the conflict's tensest and most decisive naval engagements. English and Dutch warships patrolled the strait in long, deliberate lines, their sails slack in the dawn. Breeze as lookouts scanned the horizon for sails of enemy fleets. Merchant convoys laden with wool, saltfish, and Dutch grain moved in guarded columns, each ship escorted by frigates, flying the Red Cross of St. Olive, George and the Orange Lion of the United Provinces. Their mission was simple yet vital: to keep Spain and France cut off from the riches of the Americas and the Spice Islands, thereby choking their war chests dry. Opposite them, the combined French-Spanish fleet thundered through the Mediterranean, evading blockading squadrons, with every advantage of familiarity with the winding coastlines. At sea, the two sides met in swirling maelstroms of smoke and thunder. Cannons roared in deafening volleys, sending iron shot arcing across the water, smashing into wooden hulls with bone-jarring impact. Sails ripped, masts splintered, and decks ran slick with seawater and the blood of fallen sailors. In the swirling haze, English gunners aimed for the enemy's rigging in hopes of crippling pursuit or escape, while French captains returned fire with a ferocity born of desperation to protect their supply lines. When the smoke cleared at evening's end, crippled ships from both sides lay adrift or hove to, crews scrambling to repair damage by lantern light. The English-Dutch flotilla, though battered, succeeded in its objective. The French-Spanish supply vessels were forced to retreat toward Cadiz and Cartagena, laden with shot and shot away from supporting the armies across the Pyrenees. This victory, small in the grand sweep of the war, nevertheless sent ripples of relief through London and Amsterdam, where merchants breathed easier, knowing their trade routes remained open for another season. Meanwhile, on the European continent, the allied armies of Austria, England, and the Dutch Republic set to work besieging France's fortified frontier towns. Between the shifting hedgerows and canal networks of the Spanish Netherlands, the Triple Alliance dug trench lines, extending miles of earthworks towards citadel and rampart. Day after day, sappers tunneled beneath walls, packing galleries with explosives to collapse bastions in pre-dawn assaults. Artillery trains, scarcely visible through mud and mist, hauled heavy siege guns into position, battering stone after stone until breaches yawned wide enough for infantry to charge. In Italy and Germany, a different style of warfare unfolded. Austrian and Allied forces moved through the narrow Alpine passes, launching lightning raids on French garrisons in Milan and Turin. Skirmishing cavalry dashed ahead, harrying supply wagons and cutting off retreat where fortified towns stood. Generals attempted encirclements, using mobile field artillery to pin defenders behind shattered gates. On the open fields of northern Italy, Austrian infantry held square formations against cavalry charges, trading disciplined volleys of musket fire for the shock of sabres. Both sides learned that speed and surprise could undo even the most stalwart defences. Lightning counterattacks often turned sieges into standoffs, forcing commanders to withdraw and regroup. Back in the British Isles, Highland regiments answered the call to arms and joined the English Expeditionary Force, clad in tartan and kilt. These veteran soldiers brought their reputation for fierce discipline and terrible, rolling volleys of fire. They were deployed along the Scheldt and Rhine, where their rapid advances and sudden flanking strikes disrupted French supply depots. Their presence lent a fierce reputation to the Allied right wing, sending French officers scrambling to shore up their exposed flanks. While armies maneuvered across fields and fortresses, navies continued their campaign to strangle the enemy's commerce. The newly rebuilt Spanish fleet, bolstered by Bourbon reforms, attempted to ferry supplies across the western Mediterranean, but found itself shadowed by squadrons from Portsmouth and Rotterdam, blockade runners, sleek and low in the water, darted between warships under cover of night, but more often than not they were chased down and seized. Their valuable cargoes auctioned off in prize courts to fund further military operations. This constant interdiction of trade not only starved Spanish and French garrisons of provisions, but also undermined the flow of tax revenue that sustained their war effort. As winter approached, both sides prepared for the arduous cold. Siege lines froze in place, ditches clogged with ice, and the roar of cannon replaced by the crack of muskets in bitter skirmishes. Sailors clung to battered decks as storms raged through the Straits of Gibraltar, testing the seaworthiness of every ship afloat. Yet despite the harsh conditions, no side could afford to pause. The balance of power in Europe, and indeed across the Atlantic world, hung in the balance. Thus, the naval and land campaigns of the War of the Spanish Succession forged themselves into a theatre of relentless pressure. Gibraltar's waves bore witness to brutal sea duels. Belgian canals cradled trenches alive with malevolent intent. Italian valleys echoed to the crack of rifle and cavalry charge, and Scottish veterans earned fresh laurels beneath distant banners, whether on the rolling deck of a frigate or at the mouth of a fortress cannon. Each man played his part in a conflict that would redraw the map of Europe and usher in a new age of warfare, one where the fortunes of kings and empires would be decided not only by the swords they wielded, but by the oceans they controlled, and the fortresses they could starve into submission. By the time the war reached its midpoint, Spain's once formidable treasury had been bled dry by years of conflict. Silver and gold shipments from the Indies, once the lifeblood of the royal coffers, had been diverted to fund armies and navies rather than palace banquets. Spanish government bonds, once regarded as rock-solid investments even by foreign financiers, tumbled in value as investors realized the crown could no longer meet its obligations. In London and Amsterdam, merchants and speculators who had eagerly snapped up Casa de Contratación debt found themselves holding worthless paper. Several banks, the very institutions that had financed Spain's global empire, collapsed under the load of bad loans. Their vaults emptied by panicked depositors and creditors. Back in Madrid, the mood turned grim. Tax collectors, once cordially received at the gates of Andalusian estates, now endured jeers and even violent resistance. Farmers in the olive-growing regions longed for a reprieve as levies on grain, oil, and livestock soared. Our granaries, once filled with the bounty of 1,000 harvests, lamented one villager, now groan under the weight of tax demands we cannot hope to pay. In the bustling markets of Madrid, merchants, some still reeling from the loss of Caribbean trade, faced steep duties on everything from dyed cloth to wrought iron. Goods piled up in warehouses, waiting for shipping permits that never arrived, and shopkeepers shut their shutters to avoid the shame of insolvency. Meanwhile, the reverberations of Spain's financial unravelling were felt far beyond Europe. In the Ottoman Empire, where Spaniards and Habsburg allies once traded freely for eastern silks and spices, ambassadors whispered warnings of an empire in decline. Local beys and pashas, once content to maintain formal ties, now mulled new alignments. Some provincial governors quietly looked to France or England for commercial privileges, hoping to ride a more stable patron. In India and Southeast Asia, European trading companies sensed opportunity. Dutch and English East India Company envoys wooed local rulers with promises of gold and arms in exchange for exclusive trade rights. Across the Atlantic, conditions were equally dire, and yet combustible with new possibility. The English and Dutch colonies in North America, already uneasy neighbours, seized upon Spain's weakness to undermine French colonial power. Privateers commissioned out of Boston and Amsterdam menaced French trading posts along the Atlantic seaboard, bombarding settlements in Acadia and New France. When the French crown could not dispatch adequate naval reinforcements, colonial militias rose in defense, turning once quiet coastal villages into armed camps. Skirmishes off the Carolinas and in the Labrador fisheries became common as each side sought to protect its fishing fleets and freight barges laden with furs. In the Caribbean, the pattern repeated itself on a more brutal scale. English and Dutch corsairs, their letters of marque, freshly inked by London and The Hague, struck at French and Spanish merchantmen between Cuba and Hispaniola, sugar plantations and cattle haciendas on Barbados. St. Kitts and Jamaica fortified their shores, building new blockhouses to ward off amphibious raids. Planters in Martinique and Guadeloupe watched nervously as supply ships grew scarce. Rum and coffee stocks dwindled, and enslaved labourers whispered of escape to rival colonies where provisions might be more certain. The Crown's response was hamstrung by purse strings that no longer stretched. Attempts to raise new loans, either through foreign bankers or via domestic forced loans on the nobility, met fierce resistance. The Cortes, called in emergency session, could only debate the merits of even higher levies, while ministers warned that pushing too far risked rebellion. Rural unrest in Andalusia simmered as bands of displaced peasants roamed the countryside, exacting feudal dues they could not pay, and occasionally raiding grain stores in desperate protest. Meanwhile, Spain's most prized colonies felt the squeeze. In Mexico City and Lima, viceroys reported declining silver outputs as mines ran low on timber, tools, and skilled labor resources previously shipped from Europe. Without new investment in mining infrastructure, yields fell year after year. Local merchants, strapped for Spanish coin, began bartering directly with English and Dutch merchants in Panama and Cartagena, effectively cutting Madrid out of the trade entirely. By early 1705, the financial crisis had become inseparable from the broader strategic struggle. Allied diplomats in Vienna and The Hague whispered of joint efforts to bring Spain to heel, propose a coalition embargo to starve her remaining ports, default on her debts publicly, even consider partitioning her European territories if necessary. Across unguarded frontier posts in Catalonia and the Basque Country, Austrian agents distributed leaflets promising leniency for those who would defect, preaching that Habsburg restoration might bring more stable rule than Bourbon kings, who could not even pay their troops. As the war dragged on, the once bright dream of imperial grandeur dimmed beneath the weight of red ink. Spain. For centuries, the Habsburg sun, whose rays ignited across the globe, found itself eclipsed by rising English and Dutch trade empires. Its inability to pay for warships or soldier wages forced the crown to rely on foreign subsidies, ironically from the very bankers who had once cheered its expansion. Thus, the fiscal collapse of Spain served to widen the conflict's scope even further. Where money flowed, gunpowder followed. Where coffers ran dry, alliances shifted. The spectre of ruin-haunted palace chambers in Madrid, caravels at Cadiz, trading forts in Goa, and fabled silver mines in Peru. And as Spanish ministers wrestled with the bitter calculus of war finance, the world around them constructed new orders, ones that would endure long after the last echo of cannon fire fell silent on Gibraltar's rocks. By the year 1713, Europe's great conflict had run its bloody course, and the Treaty of Utrecht drew a weary line beneath more than a decade of war. Spain, torn by internal revolt and unable to send plenipotentiaries to the negotiating table, nevertheless saw its fate decided by foreign ambassadors. England emerged with two shining prizes: Gibraltar, the jagged sentinel at the Mediterranean's gateway, and Minorca, its sheltered harbour now flying the Union Jack. These acquisitions gave the Royal Navy commanding control over naval traffic between the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, a strategic advantage it would jealously guard for generations to come. The Dutch Republic, ever vigilant against French expansion, secured guarantees that its territories in the Spanish Netherlands would be reconfigured under Austrian rule, ensuring a neutral buffer against any future Bourbon ambitions. For Austria, the treaty opened the gates to the once Spanish provinces of the southern Netherlands territories, roughly corresponding to modern Belgium and the rich Kingdom of Naples. These gains compensated for Habsburg losses elsewhere, bolstering the empire's hold on Italy and northern Europe. France, though conceding territory, managed to salvage an important victory of its own, the recognition of Philip V, grandson of Louis XIV, as King of Spain in exchange. However, the French crown bound itself to a solemn pledge never to unite the thrones of France and Spain under a single Bourbon monarch. This clause, intended as a veto against a Franco-Spanish superstate, would shape European politics by underpinning the new balance of power. Despite ceding first lands in Europe, Spain succeeded in retaining its crown. Philip V, at barely 23, returned to Madrid with his dignity intact. Yet facing the stark reality of a diminished realm, the loss of European territories was painful, for while they paled in economic value beside Spain's American colonies, they had long symbolized imperial prestige. The Bourbon king and his ministers now confronted a twofold challenge to restore Spain's fortunes at home and to safeguard its overseas domains from renewed predatory ambitions. Thus began the age of Bourbon reform. Inspired by their French cousins, Philip V and his Consejo de Castilla set about centralizing governmental authority. Regional furos and archaic privileges that had hamstrung efficient rule under the Habsburgs were curtailed. A meritocratic corps of intendants replaced many traditional provincial governors. Each delegated clear responsibilities for tax collection, public works, and justice, and accountable directly to Madrid. The old, labyrinthine bureaucracy, once split among myriad councils, was pruned and consolidated, streamlining decision-making and cutting paths of patronage that had often fostered corruption and inertia. Parallel to these administrative changes, Spain's navy received urgent attention. At the shipyards of Cartagena and Cadiz, new slipways were laid, and timber floated down the Guadalquivir to feed ambitious shipbuilding programs. French naval engineers advised Spanish shipwrights on more efficient hull designs and rigging configurations, while naval academies in Cadiz trained a new generation of officers in gunnery, navigation, and seamanship. Frigates and ships of the line, once few and outdated, began to patrol the Atlantic and Mediterranean under the Spanish flag, restoring at least a measure of maritime deterrence and protecting treasure convoys bound for Seville's Casa de Contratación. Economically, Spain found cautious recovery in the years following Utrecht. The loss of European possessions was offset, in part, by a more disciplined fiscal regime. Tax farming, once a source of royal revenue, was gradually replaced by direct collection through the intendants, reducing abuses and increasing yields. Public finances, though never as flush as before, stabilized sufficiently to service the national debt without resort to constant defaults. Slow, steady shipments of silver from the viceroyalties of Peru and Mexico replenished the treasury, while stricter oversight of colonial trade administered by the revitalized Council of the Indies curbed smuggling and ensured that customs duties reached Madrid. Socially, the Bourbon reforms encountered resistance, especially among the entrenched grandees and Creole elites of the Americas. But the energy of modernization proved contagious. Roads and postal routes improved communication across the peninsula, facilitating both commerce and governance. In the ports, merchants regained confidence as the naval escorts reduced privateer attacks. Agricultural productivity, encouraged by royal incentives for crop diversification, began to edge upward, easing the burden on farmers long strained by war taxes. By the mid-century, Spain, though no longer the unchallenged superpower of the Habsburg era, stood renewed in its institutions and more aware of its limitations. The Treaty of Utrecht had ended a war that nearly shattered the realm. The Bourbon reforms rebuilt its foundations. A centralized state, a capable navy, and a stabilized economy provided a framework in which Spain could remain a contender on the European stage and protect its transoceanic empire. And so, from the ashes of battlefield defeats and territorial concessions, rose a reformed monarchy, its crown narrower, perhaps, but its sinews strengthened. The Treaty of Utrecht may have reshaped maps, yet it also compelled Spain to rethink and reconstruct itself, laying the groundwork for a new chapter in its storied history. Under the reign of Philip V, Spain embarked upon a series of sweeping changes known collectively as the Bourbon Reforms, each designed to modernize a realm long weighed down by archaic privileges and outdated institutions. First among these measures was the abolition of feudal exemptions that had allowed local lords and ecclesiastical bodies to evade royal taxes. Vast estates that once answered only to tradition now fell under the direct authority of the crown, ensuring that revenues flowed more predictably into the royal treasury. Where once a farmer in Castile might pay tithes to a duke or bishop, he now remitted his dues to a newly established network of inspectors, answerable to Madrid. Next came a thorough overhaul of the civil service. Gone were the days when noble birth alone secured a seat in the administrative apparatus. Instead, Philip's ministers sought out men of proven ability, lawyers, cholas, and military officers, training them in royal academies in Toledo and Madrid. These talented bureaucrats, organized into tribunals and intendancies, managed everything from local justice to road maintenance. Their loyalty lay not with dynastic factions or local interests, but with the crown itself. A newly erected Consejo de Castilla oversaw their work, ensuring that policies formulated in the palace reached every corner of the kingdom without being diluted by parochial concerns. Meanwhile, Spain's armed forces underwent a profound transformation modelled on the French example. Under the watchful eye of veteran officers seconded from Versailles, the infantry was reorganized into permanent regiments with standardized uniforms and drill manuals. Gone were the irregular levies roused only in times of crisis. In their place stood professional soldiers who trained year-round, received regular pay, and expected promotion through merit rather than patronage. Artillery units, once little more than ad hoc crews wielding mismatched cannon, were reformed into disciplined corps, with specialists in gunnery and logistics. New foundries at Pamplona and Zaragoza produced uniform field pieces, and mobile caissons carried powder and shot wherever the king's banners led. At sea, too, Bourbon zeal spurred a renaissance. The shipyards of Cartagena and Cadiz saw their aged docks extended to accommodate warships of the line. Naval architects introduced sleeker hulls and stronger timbers, while French engineers instructed Spanish carpenters in new methods of copper sheathing. A naval academy in Cadiz taught midshipmen the rigours of navigation and gunnery. Convoys, bound for the Americas, now sailed under the protection of frigates and ships of the line, ensuring that treasure from Peru and Mexico reached Seville with greater safety and regularity than ever before. Transatlantic. The Council of the Indies, reinvigorated by royal decree, assumed far stricter oversight of colonial commerce, whereas smuggling and local favoritism had once drained the treasury of untold wealth. New regulations mandated that all silver, cochineal, and cacao pass through authorized ports. Royal factors in Lima and Mexico City kept detailed ledgers, enforced quotas at the mines, and audited ship manifests for irregularities. In the Casa de Contratación at Seville, customs officials calibrated duties with mathematical precision, reducing the leeway for corruption. Though Creole merchants and colonial elites grumbled at these heightened controls, seeing their private profits shrink, they could not deny the impact on royal finances. Tax revenues from the Americas stabilized, reducing the need to borrow abroad at crippling interest rates. Resistance to these reforms was real. Nobles long accustomed to autonomous power bristled at the new intendants. Colonial merchants, a class that had built its fortunes in lax regimes, organized petitions and, on occasion, outright defiance. Yet Philip's government, armed with a revitalized bureaucracy and a reformed military, had the means to enforce compliance. Troops garrisoned royal ports, auditors rode circuit through the viceroyalties, and sentries along the Guadalquivir ensured that ships sailed only under official sanction. Over time, the combined effect of these measures became unmistakable. Revenues rose steadily, allowing Madrid to underwrite both domestic programs and overseas expeditions without defaulting on its debts. The professional army and modern navy deterred foreign encroachments, restoring a measure of prestige to the Spanish flag. Better roads and communications knit the peninsula together, facilitating commerce and strengthening royal authority in previously restive provinces. By mid-century, the Bourbon reforms had laid the groundwork for Spain's cautious revival. Though still shadowed by the losses of the War of the Spanish Succession, the kingdom now possessed centralized institutions capable of sustaining imperial ambitions. The ancient regime of tangled privileges gave way to a streamlined state, one in which merit, disciplina, and strategic oversight began to supplant tradition, privilege, and regional patronage. In the sleepy dawn of this new era, Spain stirred from the dreams of its Habsburg past, tentatively stepping into a future shaped by reasoned governance and an increasingly capable hold on both land and sea. In the wake of the prolonged Spanish Succession War, hundreds of thousands of ordinary people found themselves torn from their homes and cast into a desperate flight for survival. Across the arid fields of Navarra, the rolling olive groves of Catalonia, and the terraced orchards of Valencia, entire peasant families abandoned the land they had farmed for generations. Clutching little more than a battered clay jug and a small sack of barley seed, they set out on foot through tangled forests and over rugged mountain passes. Driven by the faint hope of refuge in southern France and the Piedmont region of Italy, their journey was an ordeal of unimaginable hardship. Marches that spanned weeks became months, as the refugees traversed remote trails where food was scarce and spring water often ran dry. Many succumbed to the gnawing pangs of hunger or the blistering heat of summer days, while others fell prey to pestilence, typhus, malaria, and even bubonic plague ravaged their ranks. Bands of highwaymen and undisciplined soldiers, notorious for their green-coated raiding parties, preyed upon these vulnerable columns, stripped of their scant possessions, beaten and left by the roadside. Countless men, women, and children perished long before they glimpsed a friendly shore. Those who managed, against all odds, to stagger into port cities like Cadiz or Barcelona found no sanctuary awaiting them. The docks, once bustling with merchant vessels and naval escorts, were choked with makeshift hovels and lean-tos fashioned from driftwood and tattered canvas. Thousands huddled beneath woven mats, shivering in the damp sea breeze, as they waited for relief that never seemed to arrive. Cholera and dysentery swept through these squalid encampments, turning despair into panic. Mothers wailed over fevered children, and men stared blankly at rotting grain they could no longer afford to buy. Charitable organizations run by the Catholic Church, once pillars of support, struggled to stem the tide of human misery. Cloistered friars distributed stale loaves and lukewarm broth, their goodwill undone by the overwhelming need. With limited funds and dwindling supplies, they could offer only minimal succor. As the weeks passed, even that meagre assistance waned under the weight of endless requests. Local officials, themselves, stretched thin by wartime demands, found their coffers empty and their authority questioned. In the teeming alleys of the refugee quarters, desperation bred its own tragedy. Children orphaned by disease or violence were snatched by human traffickers, peddling them into servitude or worse. Elderly peasants, unable to fend for themselves, collapsed and died in doorways. The once proud farmers of Valencia, now reduced to begging for a crust of bread, fanned out along the city streets, their eyes hollow with the realization that their world had been irrevocably shattered. Meanwhile, the very fabric of Spain's rural economy was fraying. Fields lay untended, olive trees overgrew, and irrigation canals silted up. In the absence of their owners, bandits set fire to barns for sport or sustenance, turning once fertile valleys into charred ruins. Towns that had thrived on agricultural trade became ghostly shells, their marketplaces silent and their warehouses empty. For those refugees who pressed on to Provence or the alpine valleys of Piedmont, relief was hardly guaranteed. Local peasantries, themselves wary of sudden influxes, closed gates and barred doors. France and Savoy, already coping with their own wartime strains, offered passage but little integration. Refugee camps sprouted in border towns, echoing the makeshift settlements of Spain. There, too, disease and deprivation stalked survivors, and the weary travellers whispered of Spain's lost glories. Yet amid the bleakness, small acts of kindness shone through. In a Provençal village, a widow opened her barn to shelter a dozen starving families during a harsh winter. In Turin, a local guild organized clandestine soup kitchens for Spanish exiles. These scattered gestures could not reverse the tide of human suffering, but they offered fleeting warmth in an otherwise merciless era. By the time the war's guns finally grew silent, Spain had endured not only territorial losses, but an epic humanitarian calamity. The exodus of its peasantry left scars on the land, and in the collective memory of a people, generations would remember the sight of empty fields and deserted village squares, the haunting cries of children lost to fever, and the silent columns of refugees winding toward distant borders. In this vast tragedy of dislocation, the War of the Spanish Succession revealed its deepest cost: the shattering of countless lives, the fracturing of communities, and the erosion of trust in institutions once deemed sacred. It stands as a somber reminder that the greatest casualties of war are not always measured in miles of captured territory, but in human lives uprooted, hopes extinguished, and the lingering echoes of grief in silent countryside lanes. In the Americas, the reverberations of the War of the Spanish Succession struck with brutal immediacy. In the high plateaus of Peru and the sun-baked hills of central Mexico, silver mines that had once poured wealth into the royal coffers slowed to a trickle. The flow of capital and expert engineers from Spain had been diverted to military ends, leaving extraction operations understaffed and underfunded. Ore that once gleamed on the assay floor gathered dust, and the great Spanish galleons carrying bullion to Seville sailed half-empty or not at all. In Lima and Veracruz, bankers and moneylenders, pillars of the colonial economy, found their vaults echoing with emptiness. Letters of credit issued against anticipated silver shipments turned to worthless paper as shipments stalled indefinitely. Merchants who had speculated on future deliveries faced ruin. Agents of the Casa de Contratación in Seville reported a surge in default notices and frantic pleas for emergency loans. Local treasurers, forced to maintain the veneer of solvency, tapped every available reserve, only to discover that the storehouses held little more than casks of spoiled wine and barrels of salted fish. Against this backdrop of fiscal collapse, indigenous communities in the Andes rose in open revolt. Long subjected to onerous meter labor drafts and heavy tributes, Quechua and Aymara miners seized the moment of colonial weakness. Bands of highland warriors descended upon the Cerro Rico near Potosi, driving Spanish overseers from the shafts and looting the silver cutting houses. In the sugar haciendas of the Yucatan and Veracruz, Maya workers faced with soaring corvée demands set fire to cane fields and sabotaged milling equipment. Their resistance was not merely an expression of age-old grievances, but a direct response to the intolerable burden imposed by a crown that could no longer protect or even feed them. As the colonial economy spiraled, English and Dutch merchants saw both crisis and opportunity. They organized what came to be known as the Refugee Maritime Lifeline, a network of shipping routes skirting Spanish patrols around the Caribbean and the Atlantic. Fast sloops and brigantines carried grain, salted meat, timber, and tools from ports in Boston, Bristol, and Rotterdam to Spanish-American settlements on the brink of famine. These vessels also transported migrants, artisans, small-scale farmers, and exiled merchants seeking fresh starts in the British colonies of North America. In ports such as Charleston and Philadelphia, colonial administrators hastily parceled out land grants, eager to bolster their own economies with skilled newcomers. This influx of refugees reshaped the demographic tapestry of English colonies. In Carolina, Dutch-born coopers set up workshops alongside English tanners. In New York, Spanish-speaking weavers introduced new textile patterns. The influx of diverse settlers diluted the cultural hegemony of any single group, knitting together communities that would eventually demand greater self-rule. At the same time, the Spanish Empire's monopoly on transatlantic commerce began to crack. Dutch and English traders undercut Spanish merchants by offering more reliable delivery schedules and lower tariffs, drawing colonial producers away from Seville's grasp. Back in the Spanish-American heartlands, the Crown's inability to quell unrest or underwrite the treasury forced local authorities to resort to extreme measures. Emergency taxes levied on everything from silver sold in local markets to the brewing of maize beer to pushed ordinary colonists further into destitution. In some provinces, cabildos, municipal councils, issued ordinances requiring parish priests to collect tithes in kind, siphoning off food that might otherwise have fed a starving family. This only deepened popular resentment, fueling more uprisings that, in turn, demanded ever harsher crackdowns. By the time peace treaties in Europe began to take effect, Spain's New World possessions were gripped by open rebellion, economic stagnation, and a rising tide of alternative trade routes. The refugee lifeline that English and Dutch merchants had established proved a durable legacy, linking the economies of North America, the Caribbean, and even West Africa in new patterns of exchange. Silver and gold continued to flow, but no longer exclusively into Spanish coffers. Instead, bullion found its way into London's money markets and Amsterdam's stock exchanges, underwriting the rise of new commercial empires. Thus, the colonial crisis wrought by the War of the Spanish Succession precipitated a transformation of the Atlantic world. It shattered Spain's mercantile monopoly, accelerated the growth of multicultural settler societies in English North America, and emboldened indigenous and Creole populations to assert their rights. In the decades that followed, these upheavals would echo through independence movements and the forging of new nations. The refugee caravans of Spain's battered peasants and the flotillas of English and Dutch relief ships marked the beginning of an era when empire was no longer defined solely by conquest, but by the resilience and migration of people seeking both refuge and opportunity. The long years of bloodshed finally reached their weary resolution with the Treaty of Utrecht in 1613. Though Spain itself did not send its own envoys, its court still reeling from internal strife, the terms forged by England, the Dutch Republic, France, and Austria would redraw the map of Europe. England emerged with two strategic jewels: Gibraltar, the rocky sentinel guarding the entrance to the Mediterranean, and Minorca, the sheltered harbour whose deep waters now flew the Union Jack. With those prizes, the Royal Navy cemented its command over the straits, securing naval supremacy that would endure for generations. For the Dutch Republic, the treaty guaranteed that the Spanish Netherlands would pass into Austrian hands, creating a neutral buffer to the south. This arrangement preserved Dutch security without requiring costly military occupation. Austria, in turn, added the southern provinces of the Low Countries and the Kingdom of Naples to its dominion's compensation for its own territorial sacrifices elsewhere. France, having pressed its claim furiously, accepted a compromise. Philip V, grandson of Louis XIV, would reign as King of Spain, but the Bourbon crowns of France and Spain must remain forever distinct. That single clause, enshrined in ink and solemn oaths, aimed to prevent any future union of the two thrones. Spain, though diminished in Europe, retained its monarchy intact. Philip V returned to Madrid as king, though the lands of Catalonia, Aragon, and Flanders now lay under foreign rule. Yet these European realms, while symbolically significant, had never equaled the wealth drawn from silver mines in Peru or the spices shipped from Manila. The urgent task before Philip and his ministers was clear: preserve what remained of the empire and rebuild a state shattered by war. Thus began the Bourbon era of reform. Inspired by French models of governance, Philip's government undertook a comprehensive overhaul of the administrative machinery. Ancient privileges that had allowed local nobles and church officials to collect taxes and administer justice independently were curtailed. In their place, a new cadre of royal intendants, selected for ability rather than birth, was dispatched to provinces across Spain. Reporting directly to the crown, these officials standardized procedures for tax collection, judicial appeals, and public works, creating a more coherent and responsive bureaucracy. Parallel to administrative reform was a transformation of the military. Drawing upon French expertise, the infantry was reorganized into permanently maintained regiments. Each soldier issued a uniform and trained to consistent drill standards. Artillery corps received modern cannon and standardized ammunition, while fortresses at key points such as Barcelona and Cartagena were strengthened to withstand future sieges. The new professional army, no longer reliant on feudal levies, provided a stable force for internal security and external defense. At sea, the Bourbon reforms breathed life back into Spain's navy. Shipyards at Cadiz and Cartagena were expanded, new slipways laid, and lumber floated down Spanish rivers to construct ships of the line and fast frigates. French naval architects advised on hull shapes and rigging innovations, and naval academies in Cadiz began training young officers in navigation, gunnery, and seamanship. Convoys bound for the Americas now sailed under escort, reducing losses to privateers and pirate raiders. Economically, the Crown moved to stabilize its finances. The long-ignored Council of the Indies was reinvigorated, overseeing colonial trade with greater rigor. All cargoes of silver, cocoa, and indigo had to pass through authorized ports and pay standard duties. Smuggling networks were disrupted by patrolling warships, and colonial merchants, though resentful, found that clearer regulations and reliable protection made long-term planning possible. Back in Spain, the tax system was simplified, with new schedules based on income and property value rather than arbitrary exemptions. While these measures did not instantly restore Spain's coffers to their former glories, they established a steady revenue stream and reduced dependence on costly foreign loans. Socially, the reforms provoked friction. Traditional elites bristled at the loss of privilege, and colonial Creoles chafed under tighter oversight. Yet the Crown's strengthened authority, backed by a loyal professional army and expanded naval presence, ensured compliance. Over time, these changes extended beyond mere efficiency gains. They laid the foundations for a more integrated kingdom, united by common laws, shared purpose, and a revived sense of national identity. Thus, from the ashes of Utrecht's territorial concessions rose a Spain reimagined under Bourbon rule. Though the loss of European lands marked a shift in the empire's centre of gravity, the reforms positioned Spain to defend its vast overseas domains and to participate once more as an active player on the European stage. The Treaty of Utrecht closed one chapter in history, but under Philip V and the Bourbon reforms, Spain opened another one, guided by centralized governance, a professional military, and an ambition tempered by the hard lessons of war. By the time the ink dried on the Treaty of Utrecht in 1613, Europe had not only redrawn its borders, but forged a new guiding principle of statecraft, the balance of power. No longer would a single dynasty be allowed to dominate the continent unchecked. Instead, the great powers England, France, the Dutch Republic, Austria, and Spain, even in its weakened state, agreed, whether openly or tacitly, to form shifting coalitions designed to curb any would-be hegemon. In this sleepy yet seismic shift, diplomacy began to take precedence over endless campaigns of conquest. Under the new dispensation, alliances became as fluid as the tides. One moment England and the Dutch stood arm in arm with Austria against Bourbon France. The next they might negotiate separate accommodations to check Habsburg ambitions. This flexibility reflected a growing awareness that rigid blocks only invited perpetual war, whereas loose networks of cooperation could serve as a brake on unilateral expansion. Monarchs and ministers met in candlelit drawing rooms rather than mustering armies, sharing intelligence, assurances, and sometimes whispered threats to keep one another honest. To facilitate these understandings, periodic diplomatic congresses were established, precursors to the international conferences that would take shape centuries later. Though the first of these gatherings bore the awkward airs of ad hoc negotiation, they set a powerful precedent. Major disputes could be aired, and compromises hammered out around a table, rather than across a battlefield. Treaties signed in these halls carried the force of collective promise, binding signatories to terms that, in theory at least, transcended the whims of any single court. Of course, the balance of power was far from perfect in practice. Treaties were broken, secret pacts proliferated, and rivalries simmered just beneath the surface. Yet, even when these arrangements unraveled, the habit of diplomatic engagement persisted. Europe's rulers learned that it was often cheaper in blood and treasure to haggle over protocol and guarantees than to besiege a city or storm a fortress. This emerging norm of negotiation planted the seeds of modern international law, with its emphasis on treaties, arbitration, and collective security. Spain, chastened by its losses at Utrecht, found itself at the nexus of these evolving dynamics. No longer could Madrid assume that Bourbon solidarity meant automatic French backing, nor could it overlook the grudging support of erstwhile enemies like Austria. Philip V and his ministers adopted a policy of cautious pragmatism, courting alliances with Britain or the Dutch when it suited them, and distancing themselves when interests diverged. This cautious stance marked a departure from the grandiose Habsburg view of universal monarchy. Spain now spoke softly, but carried a capable professional army and a revitalized navy to back its words. Over the following decades, Spain's diplomatic posture became one of measured engagement. Envoys carried credentials, stamped with precise instructions, negotiate trade agreements in Cadiz with the English, confer military subsidies with Austria in Brussels, and attend joint councils in The Hague to monitor French activities. Each of these missions reinforced the notion that Spain's security depended not only on its own strength, but on the web of guarantees stretching across Europe. By weaving itself into the balance of power system, Spain preserved its remaining territories and its hard-won domestic reforms. The long-term legacy of Utrecht's diplomatic revolution was profound. Although conflicts would continue indeed, the wars of the 18th century often erupted in spite of treaties. The idea that permanent alliances and regular congresses could prevent total war endured. Great powers came to recognize that they shared a common interest in stability. Even as they vied for advantage, the balance of power, though imperfect, became the lodestar for 18th and 19th century diplomacy, guiding the Congress of Vienna and later concert arrangements. And so, from the quiet chambers of Utrecht, emerged a new world of controlled rivalry. Where once kings had dreamed of all-encompassing empires, they now accepted limits on their own ambitions. Enforced by a system of mutual assurance, Spain's cautious diplomacy after Utrecht was not a sign of weakness, but an adaptation to this new order, one in which treaties, not trebuchets, became the weapons of choice. In this gentle but enduring reordering, Europe took a hesitant step away from endless war and toward the delicate balance that would shape its destiny for centuries to come. As we drift back from the hushed halls of Madrid and the turbulent seas of Gibraltar, this journey through Charles II's final chapter offers more than a catalogue of medical horrors and dynastic strife. It reminds us that the consequences of unchecked ambition, whether crowned by birth or forged in treaties, can echo for generations. From the peppercorn-sized heart that struggled to pump life to the hydrocephalic skull that suffocated thought, each anatomical revelation stands as testimony to the hazards of hereditary isolation. Equally, the War of the Spanish Succession and the Treaty of Utrecht teach us that even the greatest empires must bow before the principles of diplomacy and balance. Through this tale, we learn the vital importance of listening to expert voices, physicians, engineers, and scholars rather than relying on superstition or unchallenged tradition. Charles II's plight illustrates what happens when science is shunted aside in favor of rote ritual, and how a body, like a state, can wither when its vital channels are clogged by dogma. Conversely, the Bourbon reforms show how rational governance, meritocratic appointments, military professionalization, and centralized administration can revitalize a nation even after catastrophe. Moreover, the birth of the balance of power doctrine at Utrecht underscores that security emerges not from overwhelming might, but from the delicate equilibrium of interests. In today's world, where nations grapple with global challenges, pandemics, climate change, technological disruption, this lesson remains urgent. We see that forging flexible alliances, upholding international law, and honoring collective responsibilities can avert the ruinous cycles of conflict that once scarred Europe's map. Finally, the human dimension of this story, the refugees trudging through forests toward unfamiliar ports, the peasants crushed by taxes, the colonial miners rising in revolt, reminds us that war's true toll is borne by ordinary souls. Their suffering invites empathy and warns us to seek solutions that prioritize humanitarian lives over dynastic prestige. So, as you reflect on the tiny, failing heart that beat beneath royal robes, and the grand treaties penned in distant congresses, consider the enduring value of science grounded in reason, governance tempered by accountability, and diplomacy guided by mutual respect. May this narrative of decay and renewal encourage us to embrace expertise, safeguard balance, and remember that no crown, however glittering, can substitute for the health, dignity, and freedom of the people it purports to serve.